Welcome everyone to today's discussion panel on storytelling and conservation goals organized by People's Planet Project. My name is Mira Hayden, and as project coordinator for People's Planet Project, I will be moderating the panel today. We will have 5 speakers giving different perspectives within their sectors, addressing the main topic and question of the panel, which is how is storytelling beneficial for those communities with conservation goals, so specifically looking at Indigenous communities. Let me quickly tell what People's Planet Project does and introduce the speakers, and then we will start. So People Planet Project is a non-profit organization and combines the power of audiovisual storytelling in the form of participatory films, geospatial data analysis and Indigenous rights advocacy to achieve sustainable policy change, strengthen conservation goals and combat deforestation. So let me welcome the speakers. First off, to give a research perspective on the topic today is Dr. Álvaro Fernández-Llamazares.
Hello, greetings from Helsinki in Finland.
So Dr. Álvaro is a post-doctoral research fellow at the University of Helsinki. He's carried out research on the role of Indigenous peoples and in their role in global sustainability, and looked into Indigenous storytelling in conservation practice. Next up in the panel will be Dr. Jeremy Gilbert, presenting the legal perspective of today's topic. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hello from cold and dark London.
So Jeremy is a legal expert on Indigenous peoples' rights and has supported the integration and recognition of Indigenous community storytelling as legal evidence in legal processes of litigation in several countries across the globe. So thank you for joining. Paula Alvarado will follow the discussion by giving a communication and policy perspective. Welcome, Paula.
Hello from Uppsala, Sweden. Thank you for tonight.
Paula has over 20 years experience in policy and human rights and sustainable development, and is currently head of strategic communication and outreach at the 10-year facility, focusing on the protection of land rights of Indigenous and local communities. Next up is Nadia Pontes. Welcome, Nadia.
Hi, hello from Brazil, from sunny Brazil. Sorry, Jeremy.
Nadia will be giving a filmmaker and journalist perspective. She's an experienced filmmaker and journalist in Brazil, working with Indigenous communities in the field to really bring across their perspective to a global audience on various issues they are facing, including environmental degradation in the Amazon. And lastly will be an integrated and interdisciplinary perspective given by the founder and executive director of People's Planet Project. Welcome, Abdel Mandili.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this panel discussion, and warm greetings from Amsterdam.
So thank you all for being here, and let's start addressing how storytelling can be beneficial for those communities with conservation goals. I give the floor to Álvaro.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this wonderful event that celebrates the power of storytelling in conserving life on Earth and for better stewardship of our planet. My interest in storytelling started when I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD among the Chimana indigenous peoples of Bolivia and Amazonia. And basically in the community where I was living, there was a folk healer that used to tell me that the forest I saw was not the same he knew. And where I could only see waterfalls, rivers, and plants and trees, he could see a universe made up of stories, songs, dreams, and the whispering of the ancestors. Trees were not just trees for him. Jaguars were not only animals for him, but rather active sentient beings filled with spirits, memory, and history. And through these teachings, I basically learned to see the Amazon not just as a forest, but perhaps more broadly as a storyscape, a repository of stories and songs that have been handed down from generation to generation. And it's not coincidental that in many indigenous languages, the concept of history and the concept of story normally often blend in the same single word, and it's because history is made up of constellations of stories that articulate who we are and how we understand the world around us. I've been working with indigenous storytellers and songkeepers for many years now, and based on the research that we've been doing, it is clear to me that storytelling is part of our shared ancestry, and it is woven into our ancient fabric. The stories we tell really matter and bring life to the world around us. That's why I entitled this slide "The Time-Honored Power of Storytelling," because our research really casts evidence on that power of storytelling in really telling the ebb and flow of the natural world and people's place within that flow. Our research really has casted evidence on storytelling as a prism for looking at human nature interrelationships in all their complexity and magnificence. And therefore, I understand storytelling as a form of biocultural heritage, worthy of conservation, revitalization, and celebration as well. For many indigenous communities, these stories are a repository or a storehouse for traditional ecological knowledge. These stories embed ancestors' knowledge, teaching, and wisdom. They carry the word of the ancestors across time and from deep in our sacred memory. And this extends also to music making. I tend to always speak a lot about music because in many indigenous cultures, storytelling also happens through music making, through music. Like in this slide, you can see a Chimane woman playing a violin, and we've been documenting, for instance, many ritual songs of the Chimane and how those ritual songs encode the proper ways of interacting with the natural world and with the spirits that inhabit the forest. For other groups like the Temyar people in Malaysia, songs are maps. They are known for singing their landscape, and therefore it's been often said that through these songs and through these stories, we can really trace and document rights, traditional rights and responsibilities towards the lands and the waters where indigenous peoples live, because they are basically archives of biocultural memory of ancestral homelands, of cultural keystone places, of species that roamed in those traditional ancestral homelands, and therefore they really tell the history of these communities. Unfortunately, we also know that many of these oral-based traditions are at risk of attrition, and that's not without really paying justice or really mentioning or highlighting that there's powerful cultural continuity in indigenous storytelling. The fact that these stories and the extent to which they continue to be celebrated, continue to be told, continue to be shared, attests to the resilience of indigenous cultures and to the endurance of their life worlds. But it's also true that we are facing very, very dramatic social and ecological changes that are really putting some of these traditions into risk, and with virtual no documentation for many of these oral-based forms, some of them at risk of dying with the elder generation, such as the case of the Dasnech indigenous peoples with whom I've been working for the last 4 years. The first time that we set the foot in North Kenya, in the area where the Dasnech people live, some of the elders were sharing their concerns that they thought that much of their oral history had gone undocumented, and they really feared that some of these oral traditions might be lost over time, and therefore they were really requesting assistance in working together for documenting some of these traditions. That's what we've been doing with Dasnech storytellers for the last 4 years. We've been working together in trying to honor and celebrate their rich storytelling traditions. And those storytelling forms really tell a lot about the natural world, and they really carry lots of traditional ecological knowledge about the wildlife in the area and in the local ecosystems. So we've been working through participatory methodologies to really try to record, transcribe, translate those stories and make them available in the format that the Dasnech communities want them to be available. So it's been a a really long two-way dialogue on really making sure that we use the best participatory methodologies to make sure that any documentation happens according to their needs and their views. And all that conversation led to the book that you can see here, which is a bilingual book called The Folktales and Songs of the Dasnetch. That it's a book that they wanted to be available as a pedagogical resource in the local schools because the Dasnetch people were concerned that many of the materials that were in the schools did not capitalize on the rich culture of the Dasnetch people and were not available in the local language. So we made this book, which was the second book ever to be written in Dasnetch language. It's a book that has been completely authored by the Dasnetch community, and they hold the copyright and the intellectual property rights for this book. We've just basically helped a little bit in editing it. But it's really a way of documenting this knowledge. It's a way of really asserting cultural identity and recognizing the cultural identity of the Dasnetch people. We presented this book in the National Museums of Kenya last year with a delegation of Dasnetch storytellers and songkeepers. And that was a very historic moment because it was the first time that the Dasnetch heritage was being represented in the National Museum. And as I said, that was a way for the Dasnetch community to assert their cultural identities and their cultural rights in the context of Kenya. But for me, the beauty of projects such as this one does not only lie on the documentation itself as a mere compilation of folklore, but rather on the fact that by documenting these traditions, you can also help to revitalize those social and cultural contexts in which the stories are alive. Those contexts such as the storytelling session that you can see here, where stories are shared and told and discussed and transmitted, and by so doing you can really contribute to support those networks of intergenerational transmission of traditional ecological knowledge and make sure that these stories are alive for many generations. All I can say from a scholarly or research or academic perspective is that we really know that for many indigenous communities, those stories are very, very important as they construct and maintain and mobilize people's intimate connections with their local ecosystems and with their natural world. Those stories really are avenues for gaining a more complex and nuanced appreciation of the natural world around us and in our detailed biocultural archives. And as such, it should be a conservation imperative to really make sure that they are documented, celebrated, recognized, supported, and revitalized. And I started being a conservation scientist concerned about ecosystems, plants, genes, and species. But I've come to realize that those beautiful storyscapes that there are in our planet are also worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for those storyscapes because they should be considered as an essential and genuinely beautiful component of the diversity of life on Earth. That's all I had to say insofar. Thank you very much. And I hope that you like the beautiful pictures in the presentation, which were taken by my good friend, Joan de la Maya, who's a conservation photographer.
Thank you so much, Álvaro. So within your presentation and also articles I've read that you've written, you really acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are really important for conservation practice. In your experience and research, what role do you think that Indigenous storytelling can have for global sustainability as a whole, and why are Indigenous people so important? What would you say concretely? Because global sustainability affects us all, of course. And so why are Indigenous people so important in this, and how could storytelling help with bringing this message across?
Well, thanks for that wonderful question. We know that over a quarter of the world's terrestrial surface is owned or inhabited or managed by Indigenous peoples. And that's a large proportion of the world's biodiversity. There's no way we can safeguard that biodiversity if we don't really work with indigenous peoples, and we know that conservation, unfortunately, has a strong colonial legacy, and sometimes conservation practitioners haven't been employing the best tools to really work alongside or in partnership with indigenous peoples, acknowledging also that many indigenous peoples are conservationists in their own rights, and they've been critical agents in really safeguarding much of the world's biodiversity. I really think that storytelling offers many opportunities. When I speak with indigenous peoples representatives, they often tell me that a critical trait to work together to conserve biodiversity is humility. Humility from the side of conservation practitioners, from conservation researchers like myself, and from basically people that want to work with indigenous peoples. And I think that storytelling is perfect in the sense that there's nothing more humbling than sitting around the fire and sharing stories, than really paying, investing time at listening to the stories of people and their oral histories, and all what that means for the people with whom we work. So I really think that it can offer us an excellent setting for discussing what we want to conserve and for whom and how are we going to do it. And I therefore think that we should understand all these stories and all these songs and all this oral history as meaningful assertions of indigenous sovereignty and meaningful assertions of knowledge on how to really safeguard life on Earth.
Thank you so much. And on this aspect, from a legal perspective, Jeremy, what legislation is currently in place to protect Indigenous rights and their link with protecting conservation, if any?
Okay, so to take it from there, law has been very slow to change because for a very long time, indigenous people have been on the wrong end of international law, with many parks being created that has been a push from indigenous peoples where they were not seen as part of the Western wildlife. So there was a lot of damage done actually in terms of environmental protection to indigenous communities. It's only in the last 10, 15 years that there was a bit of a U-turn, that finally we started to see that indigenous people actually are the ones that are protecting nature. But I will talk of many of the communities that are still suffering from conservation. So this is where storytelling is very important. It's to reverse this very Western vision of what is wilderness, which is very damaging still in many countries, in Africa mainly, but still in Asia as well. This community has been pushed because government use the excuse of protection of the environment, which is not based on reality. We know indigenous peoples have been there way before the states. They are much better at protection of the environment. So the law is slowly catching up, but it needs to integrate storytelling from indigenous peoples to be able to capture actually that connection with nature. Because it's been a very Western story, which doesn't actually see what Álvaro was talking about, what is the forest talk as a story to tell. So to follow on the presentation from Álvaro, this is taking on the legal aspect. So storytelling is going to be a bit different there. It's used in a way to support indigenous communities when they go to court. It's a bit of the context I was talking in my answer to you about conservation. Indigenous people have been losing access to their lands in a massive way, especially in Africa. And as a response, they're starting to use litigation to try to get the right to live on their lands. And that includes a complexity for these people because they have to prove that actually they live on the land, which is a strange way because they live there forever. But actually what the Western system have pushed on indigenous peoples is they need to prove that they have the right to live on the land. So the way to do that, there's not many ways. They don't have a piece of paper that to say this is their land, this is their forest. So what they have to do is to prove that they have a cultural connection to the land. And this is where storytelling has been very important because it becomes legal evidence. It becomes a way to prove that they have the right to be on the land because they have the storytelling there. So for me, it was a bit of a discovery as a lawyer to realize how important storytelling is because that's the only evidence you can use in court. There's nothing else. So what I'm going to talk a little bit is a few cases that are ongoing to show you how it's been difficult to translate storytelling into a legal document. That's a real struggle. So let me start first with we're going to travel to Uganda. This is the Batwa. The Batwa community live in the western part of Uganda. They are sadly the victim of what I was describing, this conservation at any cost, at pushing peoples. They live in forests, but this forest has been recognized as a national park, and as a consequence, the government has expelled them from the lands, bluntly, in '92. So since then, they don't have the right to live in the forest anymore, and they became squatters in small villages around the national park. Now they're taking legal action at the constitutional court level in Uganda, in Kampala. But the court has been asking, okay, but what is your evidence to live on that land? So the team was confronted with this problem. And this is where we started to go to the elder people, this man on the picture, for example, that are people that have lived in the forest before they were expelled from the forest. What was important for us and the community was to capture the story of the relation with the forest. So this person on the picture was giving us all the story, the relation with the bees, the relation with the forest, but also the spirituality of the connection to the forest. We recorded all this because he was quite old and he was about to disappear, and those legal processes take forever. So it was really important to be able to have the story of the elder generation, to be able to bring that to the courts, to show what is the connection with the forest and the community when the court was saying, well, you don't live there, so you don't have any right over that forest. So I wasn't, I was just the lawyer there, but the anthropologists came with us to really capture the storytelling. Even songs were used to prove the connection to the forest. So this is how I discovered, that was in 2010, and since then I've been discovering how we can use storytelling to make that legal argument. The case is still ongoing, by the way, even though it started in 2010. So this is how slow justice is. But storytelling is still the only evidence that is mainly used in court because, as I said, there's no piece of paper to say that there's a serious connection with the forest and what is the meaning of the forest for the Batwa. Traveling a bit further east in Africa, going to Tanzania, what also I discovered was important in terms of storytelling. So these are the Maasai, they live in the plain of the Serengeti. And once again, it's a story of wildlife, but also tourism. So the government has developed a massive tourist, tourism is big for Tanzania in that part of the Serengeti. So there's a massive attraction to have companies to use land, to put tourism there, but also they decided to stop the grazing, so to restrict the grazing of the communities, which is essential for the Maasai. They, as you can see on the picture, the cattle is basically the lifeline of the community, not only in terms of livelihood, but also as a cultural connection to the land. What we discovered was the importance of women there. In Tanzania, it's a very patriarchal government where women were not even seen as important. So what we wanted to capture was the way, and that woman on the picture gave us some amazing story on the relation with not only the cattle, but the travel. What you see at the back of the picture there are the trees. This is where the river is, which they don't have the right to go anymore because the government has put a fence there. But she was telling us all the story of the relation between the water and the cattle, and the way it's basically part of what she's doing every day. Why was it important? Because that was the only way we could prove that there was ancestral histories that were going way before the government even existed on that river and the relation with the community, because they have special language to talk about the river, they have special connections that is not even captured in the more modern legal system. The other picture you have there is the journalist that was filming. So we're trying to film the storytelling to bring that to the court, because you have to realize, I'm talking about that community, but the court is actually based 800 miles away from this in the capital city. So the judge don't have an idea of the scenery, the storytelling. So what we're trying to bring is the evidence capturing the storytelling from that woman and bring that to the judge as an evidence. We're not sure yet if it's going to work, because it's many judges would just see storytelling, it's not legal evidence. So it's also trying to prove that it's more than just a story. Many people are a bit dismissive, I think, about storytelling. They don't really see that it's as Álvaro mentioned, real history, but it is. So this is also trying to get the court to recognize this, that this is a proper evidence, that the connection, the storytelling about the river and the connection between women and the way they go there every morning is a real evidence of that right over the river. Another case I could mention, so we're still in Africa, we're going down a little bit to Kenya. And that case was finally ruled after a long time. It concerned the Ogiek community, hunter-gatherers. They live in the Mau Mau forest. Again, they've been expelled from their lands in the name of conservation. To be honest, in that case, it's more of an excuse. It was more to actually cut down the forest and to sell it. But it took a long time for the Ogiek to prove that they had the right to the land. And again, the only thing we could bring to that court, and that's why I put the picture of the court, was to film the storytelling from the community and explaining their relation to the land. The court, because I think it's a human rights court, actually listened for once, and they used storytelling, and they received the evidence that we put in a film on the storytelling as a way to prove that connection to the land, but also to prove the fact that the Ogiek do conservation of the land, because the government was trying to say that the Ogiek were cutting the forest, not respecting the plan to keep the forest, which was not based on any truth, but also was dismissive of the reality, and they explained in their storytelling why they wouldn't do such a thing as cutting the trees, because it's so important for many of the historical relationship with the land. So the court actually accepted all this as evidence, and they won the case in 2017 against Kenya. We can talk about this. Another problem is the implementation, which nothing has happened. But in that case, it was the first time that a human rights court accepted storytelling as evidence. So that's why I wanted to mention this. The last case I'd like to flag is in Namibia. And the reason I want to flag this case is because it's ongoing, but also it's exactly on what you want to talk about, which is conservation. In that case, the Etosha National Park was established by first the colonial powers back in the days, and then Namibia maintained it as an independent state. The San have been living in Etosha for as long as we have history of mankind on the planet. But they've been pushed away from the park, and again in the name of conservation, because apparently they were disturbing the wildlife. It's one of the big tourism places in Namibia. It's an important place for the GDP of the country. So you can imagine that they don't weight that much in terms of the government policy there. They've been trying to show to the government that they are not the one actually disturbing the wildlife, quite the opposite. They were protecting the wildlife and supporting wildlife to be able to live in this really harsh environment by having a very nomadic way of life, but also their own spirituality is connected to the animals that are on this park. So many of the older person, and including that woman on the picture, were explaining the way, for them, it's not possible what the government is saying that they're doing with the wildlife, especially killing elephants and rhinoceros, because for them, they are part of their identity. In all the storytelling, these are ancestral. They are part actually of their well-being of the community. So in that case, we're trying to show to the court that we cannot say that they are the ones leading to the destruction of the rhinoceros, for example, the population of Namibia, because it's such an important element in their storytelling and relation with the ancestral that it doesn't make sense for a population to go after their own history. The court case is just starting, so we have no idea if the court will accept any storytelling as evidence. But yeah, so it was, I have many other stories like this of cases, but just maybe to bring in our discussion this idea of the legal elements, that storytelling could become the only thing that indigenous communities can bring as an evidence that they have a special connection to the land. that they have a special rights over those territories because they have this long ongoing process with the elements that make it. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Do you feel, because you were saying that the court doesn't really see storytelling as legal evidence and that that's one of the main obstacles, but as this court in 2017, this court case in 2017 in Kenya, you won and you set a precedent actually for other cases. Do you feel like it's slowly getting more accepted within the court? Also, of course, it depends what court, which country, etc. But do you feel like this is going forward and improving in a sense?
Yes, I think because even talking about storytelling as legal evidence a few years ago would have been impossible. There was some cases in Canada in the early days, and again, the judges were quite racist. There's a famous sentence of a judge saying when one of the indigenous leaders is singing about the land, they say, "I'm sorry, I can't really hear you." What the judge meant was, you can't actually talk and sing in my court. So we have to realize that the legal system is quite conservative in general. You know, judges are not trained in that way. They're not really open. They don't even know indigenous communities. They are often quite far. They are in the higher part of society. So for them, accepting storytelling is, you know, a bit of a work. So I think it's very important for NGOs like the People's Planet, but Land Tenure Facility and others to really show that storytelling is serious. It's not some folklore that people might think. It's actually a real part of the legal evidence. The way, like in any other court, we will accept the book as evidence. So it's getting there slowly, as you said. The court case in 2017 was important, but again, it's more baby step. We need more of those, and we need much more of the legal profession in general to realize it's serious, because I'm talking about the judges, but I have to say some lawyers as well, when you tell them we're going to use storytelling as evidence, they look at you like you're saying something totally insane. So there's a lot of work to be done still on this. But what also I would say is important, it's give a voice to indigenous peoples, because the process of litigation is very disempowering. You know, there's a language, it's full of jargon. It's the only space that indigenous peoples can come to the court and really tell the story of the land in their own way. So it's important to support these efforts and to support any, you know, it could be a film or whatever we can bring to the courts to make sure that the voice is there. And I think the more we give the voice to indigenous peoples about storytelling in those processes, the more the legal profession is going to learn that this is actually a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And yeah, thank you so much. So to link that with you, Paula, what would you say, like from a policy perspective, how this evidence is important as well for storytelling and to be able to create policy change?
Storytelling has been the way we communicate in communities, but also in our societies, is through narratives, through telling our experience and our stories. So those are important evidence when drawing policies, when designing them, because it collects the perspectives of the communities with whom we work. So it's a very important input in terms of setting the context. As Jeremy was saying, there is a lot of, some of the sectors of our societies, regardless of where we live, are extremely conservative, and they are more influenced by hard data, when stories are what we will call soft data, soft evidence of connections to land in this particular case. And it's something that we work a lot with in the tenure facility, because we work with communities that are already recognized as a community. So they have gone through the process that Jeremy is describing, where the communities are showing evidence and connections to the land, despite living in ancestral lands for centuries at times. They don't have the legal rights to it. So to prove the legal rights, they have to show the connection. So the communities we work with have already shown the connection, but they don't have the legal properties. So, and that's when this connection to the land is shown through the knowledge of the land and that relation of the land. And one way of demonstrating that relation is through the stories that particularly the elders of the community have. And the danger is, of course, that sometimes those stories don't go all the way through the new generations. And if the new generations lose the stories, in a sense, they lose their connection to the land and their traditional knowledge, which is not only valuable for the cultural perspective, but also super important from a legal perspective, as Jeremy is pointing out. And I'm gonna talk from a land rights perspective. I am the head of strategic communications and outreach for the Tenure Facility, and the Tenure Facility is a foundation that works with directly with Indigenous communities, helping them secure their land rights and the legal land rights, which is their ancestral right. My story in terms of the connection to storytelling goes back 30 years when I was still a student at university and was doing the research for my thesis, which was focused on the Coyuriti. I'm originally from Peru, and the Coyuriti is festivity that takes place once a year in the Sinacara Valley. It's a glacial basin that sits about 16,000 feet above the sea level. And during this festivity, the celebrants just swam to this mountain up in the Andes and spent 3 days together, during which the youth in the community climb up a glacier, bring up a big piece of ice, and bring it back to the community at the bottom. And also they take these pieces of ice into the church. So there is a mixture of syncretism. And I was there studying the communication symbols of this traditional festivity, trying to understand the meaning of the different rituals and trying to understand what they are really trying to say here. What does it mean to climb a mountain? What does it mean to bring down pieces of ice? Why is there a church at the bottom of the mountain? So I was a young university student and extremely curious about all these stories around. And 3 days up in the mountains gave me a very deep sense of the conversations among the community and the richness of the stories, because this was not just about climbing up a mountain and bringing a piece of ice, but it was all the sacred rituals involved in that process and all the belief systems that the community held as very, very important for their unity, because you had people from 4 or 5 different regions in the Andes. They all belong to different ethnicities, and this was an opportunity to connect to the Coyuriti, which is the star of the white star god, and to revive the rituals that they had learned as children. Many of the people that came to the mountain had come with the parents, and the parents had come with the grandparents. So this was part of a very important ritual and tradition. And it was a very humbling experience, because it's when you realize the richness. As a student, you come with all these methodological questions, and when you are there, you understand how there are these spaces of knowledge and dialogue that if you are not part of the community, you can look at them and dismiss them. But it's only when you spend time with the community you understand how important these narratives are. And that's deeply connected to the way our brain works and the importance of stories, because the stories are really how we think. No, they're made, this is how we give meaning to life. Many researchers now look at the drawings in the caves. For example, these drawings are 27,000 years old, and they are studied today as narrative, as snapshots of life in communities, as part of storytelling rituals that are as old as humankind itself. When we know that, when we understand the richness of storytelling, and we start going into talking to the communities with our eyes, our ears, and our hearts open to understand what have we missed all our lives when we were not really listening to what communities had to say. But it also, at least in my personal case, it gave me a reflection of the stories I grew up with. As I said, I'm originally from Peru. I come from a culture where conversations happen in the kitchen over long after dinner table discussions. And I start remembering some of the conversations I had with my grandmother and my older aunt, even my mother, and how much we were taught through storytelling. In the same way, communities today share that knowledge with their children, and the guardians of the forest and the knowledge they have, for example, is a fantastic way of looking at conservational practices rooted in their governance systems and belief on how the land should be taken care of, how the land should be governed. As we have heard during this presentation, I mean, there is indigenous peoples, which are about 370 million people, and make up less than 5% of the total human population. They manage to hold over 25% of the world's land and surface and support about 80% of global biodiversity. So how can we talk about conservation without including them in the dialogue when they are a key piece to really protecting our forests? And when we talk about indigenous peoples communicating, sharing, transmitting knowledge, so their storytelling, we look at this in amazement, in wonder. But this is the way it has been forever. This knowledge has been transmitted through oral traditions, sitting around the fire, having these long conversations while harvesting, while walking in the forest. This is oral practices, oral traditional knowledge is the way it has been for a very long time. So the risk today is when the traditional knowledge process is broken and the younger generations lose that connection to their forests. Those forests, as we heard earlier today, talk to the elders, and they're just not water and trees, but there is stories. And when we lose that connection is when we put in danger not only traditional knowledge, but also the preservation of our forests. When indigenous peoples protect their forests, they're just not protecting the forest. They're really supporting the planet and doing us non-indigenous peoples a great favor, because they are also helping us, keep store carbon in the ground, prevent more of it being released in the atmosphere, clean our air, and everything else we know about biodiversity conservation. I mean, it's in this community of people interested in biodiversity, we know what those forests hold. But the role of indigenous people has come to the equation only in recent years. I've been working in communications for a very long time. And about 15 years ago, I was working for a conservation organization in Washington, D.C. And the focus was really about protecting areas. The fact of working with indigenous people was important, was relevant. But for example, giving them the governance of their territory, giving indigenous people the possibility of making decisions about how they want to govern their territory, how they're going to protect it, the legal rights, was totally out of the equation. The legal system had not caught up yet, and now it has. So now we have a wonderful opportunity to see how indigenous peoples are, by protecting their territory, also protecting our biodiversity and our forests, and being part of conservationist conversations. We, as an international organization, as a new international organization, we are currently working in 13 projects in 12 different countries. One of the countries where we work is in Panama. Our partners in Panama have brought together all the indigenous communities in the country under one organization. It's called COONAPIP, which is the community of indigenous peoples in Panama. It's a coordinator organization. It has that role. And it has brought all the voices of indigenous peoples together. They are influencing national legislation. they have bridge communication between the conservationist groups who are super strong in Panama and very focused on protecting areas, and the indigenous groups under COONAPIP have managed to be part of the discussion against prejudice, racism, dismissive treatment to their traditional knowledge. And it has taken a long time, it has taken years to really start having an open dialogue. And they have only managed to do that because all the communities under COONAPIP are working as one. And they're bringing that narrative of, we know our forests, we know where we live. If you work with us, we can help you protect the biodiversity, because there is no disconnection for indigenous peoples. What we hear all the time from our partners, is that they don't have to assess whether they look after the forest or not. They don't have to think whether they should preserve the waters or the biodiversity. That's the way it is. They live in partnership with nature. Indigenous peoples coexist side to side with nature. The trees, the animals, the jaguar, the birds, the flowers, it's part of their ecosystem. Why would you destroy them? So it's so embedded in who they are, in their identity, that they don't understand the approach of conservationist practices, excluding their indigenous capacity to provide good governance of those forests. And by good governance means preserving their territories, preserving their forests, making it really, generating livelihoods and incomes, yes, but in a way that does not offend their traditional values and the way they look at their world, which is their territory. It's not just the land. When we work with indigenous peoples, helping them in the process of getting the legal land rights, it's not just a title that they're getting. They're really getting the possibility of have the legal authority to make decisions over their territories, an authority that has been lost over the years because of our legal systems changing and not recognizing their ancestral rights. And when they actually get their land rights, they get back that legal authority to make decisions over the territories. And one of the things that they do first is trying to protect their forests from all the invasors and all the illegal and legal aggressions towards their natural resources. In Panama, for example, the COONAPIP community has started this Voces Originarias radio station, where they have got the equipment and they're using it to tell their own stories. Because I agree with the concern that some of these stories are being lost. Yes, they are. I mean, the traditional storytelling, the stories of beginning, the stories of how we do things, many of those voices are being lost, and the efforts to document them are really, really important today. But some of these ways of storytelling are also changing, and more we see effort from indigenous communities to get their voices out and to be heard. And that's part of the work that we do at the Tenure Facility. We're really working with our partners to help them get their stories out to an audience that needs to hear them, and that needs to hear them today. These are not new stories. These are not developed specifically for a certain group of audience. These are their everyday lives, their everyday concerns, but also the way they look at the world, which I think is so powerful with the storytelling. It gives us the opportunity to tell how we experience the world and share our knowledge and validate our knowledge against what is considered Western knowledge, mainstream knowledge. And it's in the humility of recognizing the value of all kinds of knowledge that I think where we really can all make an effort to be more open to that, and to understand that there are different kinds of information and knowledge coming from different parts of the world. In Belize, our partners host ceremonies around the harvesting of cacao, for example, where women sit around the table and sing and through songs tell stories of their ancestors and their practices, and how to bless the earth when you harvest, and how to do the harvesting in a way where the cacao itself conserves its life, its nutrients, its benefits. And somehow I feel that when you actually are connected to nature, you can hear her voices when you drink, a hot chocolate from their cacao harvest, because they're so connected to it. It's not just the cacao, it's everything that comes with it. And for us, people who, go to the supermarket and just buy our little, powdered cacao and put it in the milk and have a chocolate milk, this is so far away. But when you are there with the communities and you can smell the cacao, you can see how they produce it, a sip of chocolate milk tastes very differently. In Peru, we had a project last year, for example, where we produced a documentary about the story of a community. It's called the Boca Pariamano community in Madre de Dios in Peru. And it's a story of the community's journey to secure their land rights. And the process of producing this documentary was done in a very close partnership with the community. We really spent time with them discussing the story they wanted to tell. What did they want the world to know about their community? And who were the voices that were going to represent? And it was a deeply participatory process. We were more acting as the catalyzers, the catalyst of filmmaking and production, but the story, the script, the ideas were developed in a very close partnership with the community. And it's a documentary that they use to influence people that are not from the community, to motivate them to do the process of land rights and to show them the evidence of success, but also to, when they go and talk to officials at the government level, this is something that they can bring to the table and show that this is the life in the community, and again with their voices. In the same region in Madre de Dios, we plan to do a training with 30 young indigenous leaders. That the in-place training was canceled because of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. But our partners in Peru move the training to an online platform, and by using Zoom and WhatsApp, they managed to train 5 young indigenous members of communities and give them the technique and the skills they needed to tell their own stories and to take those stories out of the community. Because I don't feel that as a communications specialist, I have to go to a community to tell them how to tell stories. They do that better than any of us. Storytelling is so much ingrained in community life. But what we can do, is help them get the stories out to those people who need to see them, to understand and start appreciating all the knowledge of life in a community. So with this training, that's what we did. And there are links on our website for this. And there are 4 or 5 documentaries at the moment produced entirely by young community members. And of course, the documentaries at the moment are about COVID-19. Some of them are about traditional medicine. Some of them is about an old basket weaver, for example, that died of COVID-19 and all the knowledge that was lost when she died, as well. So there is a very deep connection to nature, to traditional knowledge. But what is most important is that this is their perspective. I wouldn't say this is journalism, because it's not. Journalism requires a different set of skills, but it's today's storytelling. And like this, we have many communities in Brazil, for example, as well, where they're working with Instagram and social media, different social media platforms, and they're becoming so strong and so savvy to get their stories out. In Indonesia, there is our partners are working with the youth homecoming movement. It's an initiative that started a few years ago, and it's totally led by indigenous peoples. They had a very big gathering and decided to start this movement, calling their colleagues from the cities to return back to the communities to help defend, protect, and manage their territories. They realized that if everybody leaves, then who's going to stay behind to really protect their forests? So they organized a series of schools for the young in the community. And while many of these young men and women still go to traditional schools, they also spend their afternoons in the local schools where they learn about the forest, they learn about conservation, they learn about traditional ways of living. So this young generation of Indonesians are able to walk the two worlds, the indigenous world and the more kind of city world. So they have put both knowledge together. And it's a very powerful movement, and its success has been very clear during COVID-19, when COVID-19 hit these areas in Indonesia, these communities with lots of young people in them were able to close and to be self-sufficient and to use their traditional knowledge, the traditional knowledge that had been transmitted through stories to the young to protect their territory and to survive the crisis and the lack of food and everything else that hit them very, very suddenly. So with this presentation, I wanted to share with you some of the examples that we see around the world. These are not the only examples we have, but there are many, many other stories that we could share today. But what is important for at least for me, for you to remember, is that storytelling is part of community life in traditional communities, in indigenous communities, since the beginning. It's not something new. And if we listen with real openness, we can rescue and learn from their ways of living. And if we can integrate those ways of living in conservational practices with a humility of accepting that we are the ones learning and they are the ones teaching us, then I think we can have some good results in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. You were saying that what is really missing at the moment is this recognition of land rights within the governance sector, and that bringing their voice to a global audience is crucial, no? And that if you would have to say in really shortly, in your view, what is the biggest obstacle within this sector for them to acknowledge these land rights?
It varies a lot from country to country. The processes are very different, so it will be very hard to have one statement. One of the things that we have identified is sometimes it's administrative bottlenecks. You know, there is not enough people who knows the legislation and who has the resources to implement it. This is left as something that can be done when there are resources available. So it's not a priority in many countries to implement the land rights legislation and give these communities the governance of their territory. There are, of course, as well, political interests and economic interests, because these lands are extremely rich in resources. But something that we see a lot is lack of technical capacity and administrative capacity to expedite the processes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we'll go on to Nadia. I don't know if you want to say anything with regards to, as a journalist, you're working with Indigenous people on the ground a lot. So I guess maybe you could say something about their perspective on what is being done on a policy sector and on land rights, etc.
Yeah, it was interesting to listen to all the panelists, and I was just thinking of the stories that I have already written, you know, the things they have already experienced on the ground. It is really important. It was really interesting for me. Well, I can say about the Brazilian situation right now. I think you are all aware that indigenous peoples here face severe attacks in their rights. And we have a government right now that was elected saying that he was against indigenous land rights and indigenous territories and demarcation. So I think our community here have been trying to get international attention, and it has been working, I think. And I think they are trying to get this pressure, you know, from outside to see some changes here in Brazil. So you asked me to share my experience as a journalist in Brazil. And I think this picture says a lot about it. It was taken during an operation in the Amazon in an indigenous land 5 years ago in the state of Pará. I was the only journalist, the only female journalist with these agents combating illegal mining, gold mining in these indigenous lands. And since then, I have been focused on these kind of stories, going on the fields, talking to people, you know, listening to them, and trying to share these stories to the world. I'm Brazilian. I work mainly for the Deutsche Welle, which is a German international broadcast. I lived in Germany for many years, but since 5 years. But since 2015, I'm back in Brazil and focus on these kind of stories, you know, environmental stories, stories that indigenous people's write, telling stories of real people. I call it real people, you know. But you know, we have a lot of attention in the Amazon. People pay a lot of attention in the Amazon, in indigenous lands there, but we have other disasters going on in Brazil. I just arrived from Mariana, a city in Minas Gerais, southeast part of Brazil, where a dam collapsed 5 years ago. Was the, you know, greatest socio-environmental tragedy in Brazil, and many indigenous communities were affected. Down the river, Doce River, you know, this this tragedy we had 19 people dead, many homeless families, nobody was arrested. And these communities are still suffering a lot. They have no clean water. They can't go fishing, and nobody's paying attention, you know. So I just wanted to bring this, to share this, to say that we have many disasters going on right now, not just in the Amazon, but just last year we had another collapse, a dam collapse like Mariana, and we have 270 people dead. 11 of them are still missing. Many communities, indigenous communities in Minas Gerais, in the same state, are still suffering a lot. Nobody was arrested because they are fighting against those huge companies like Vale, BHP, and Samarco. And I'm covering these stories, you know, since then. And I feel like it's my role as well as a journalist, bring this as a way to hear those voices, and so Brazilians don't forget what is going on. And this was my start as a video maker when I came back to Brazil. It's something wrong. It's a wrong piece of information here. It was in May 2015 when I was invited to join those brave agents. I had no idea I just said, yes, of course, I'm coming. But I had no idea that I was going to live on a war. It's like a war. Fighting crime in Amazon is like a war. And I spent 10 days with them on this occasion. We had I have this footage of gunshots, you know, in the forest. Our helicopter, we were safe in the end, but our helicopter was damaged by these gunshots. It is a dangerous ground, risky for journalists, but mainly risky for the communities who live there, for the agents. And this was an indigenous land. And this kind of crime has increased in the past 2 years. Miners are just invading indigenous land because this kind of operation has not going on. IBAMA, this environmental authority, the Brazilian Environmental Authority, has lost his power, resources, and we have been living this huge crisis, and the situation has worsened a lot. But this was just my beginning in the Amazon as a video maker. And as a reporter, I can say that you know that Brazil is huge, but I try to go everywhere, try to go where the stories are, and we face a lot of challenge and logistic challenges. Mainly to get there is really difficult. You're not able to do that by without collaboration, without the support of the local communities. They have to trust you, and they have to trust that you're going to tell their stories in the right way. I brought these pictures here. There are nice memories of two trips I did to the Amazon. This first one was in Mato Grosso, the Xingu indigenous land, which was the first one to be recognized in Brazil as indigenous land. And Sting has been here. Many famous people have been here. Raoni, this leader, well-known internationally, lives here, and I had this privilege to visit this land last year as a grantee of Pulitzer Center and Rainforest Journalist Fund. We got a fund to go there and to tell stories of the women, the indigenous women, who were organizing themselves to fight Bolsonaro's government. This is quite new because the communities in Brazil are still very macho, you know. Women are trying to find their role and in leadership. And it was interesting. We shoot a documentary in this occasion. It was interesting to see these changes going on. And the second picture was also taken last year. We were trying to go back home after 10 days in the forest, and we had to pay for a private jet. So I wanted to share those examples just for you to have the idea how difficult it can be to go where the stories are here in Brazil, to go to the forest. You know, I say that the forest decides when you get in and when you get out. You can plan everything in advance, you know, you can do everything in your power, but the forest decides. Those examples are truly about this. And the field work in Brazil can be very dangerous. Where deforestation happens and in high rates, there are also not illegal, but organized groups who are always aware of your presence, you know, as a journalist. And you can be followed by someone. It happened to me not once. And you have to be aware of this dangerous. when colleagues want to come to Brazil from abroad, I'm always, you know, I'm always preoccupied about them, because I'm not sure if they are aware of this. And it can, I wanted to, I don't want to be, you know, fatalistic, but it is dangerous. I'm not always, but I'm mainly, I'm mainly in the field by myself, shooting short films, writing stories, and I felt this danger many times, because you are dealing with people who have money, you know, to buy machines to put on the forest. You are dealing with this kind of people, and they pay, you know, and they don't want to be in the news mainly. They don't want to be named mainly. And they have this indirect support of the government somehow, you know. And now there are also other challenges, like being the wild, you know, work in the forest, which I love, but it can be dangerous, not dangerous, for your health. I had this, I got this disease last year as well. I'm not sure how to say it in English, but it's something like leishmaniasis. And you are exposed to this kind of situation, and to bring these stories. I think you really have to love, you know, what you do. And our work as journalists, you know, to go into the field and interviewing people and living with them, I think it's so important for people who have not the chance to be there, or people who don't even think about the forest peoples, you know. It's so important to bring those stories, to share these stories, so it's worthy, but one has to love this, I think, because it's not so smooth. But I just love, you know. And the rewards are, for me, you know, I can't even put in words. To be in those places and to have their trust and to tell their story is a great, great responsibility. As a non-Indigenous, it's a great responsibility. And I think it's important not just for the Brazilian listeners or readers, but also for the international community, and also for science, because I've noticed as a researcher as well that what we produce as journalists are also very well, is very recognized in some researchers, the kind of data we produce, or the kind of, it's also important for science somehow, for some kind of researchers. And yeah, we need more people doing that. We need support, because it's very expensive to do this kind of reporting, because of the logistics, as I said, and you have to pay, sometimes you have to pay for private jets, you know, to get into the place. And we need more people to doing that, not just reacting to things. Like now that we see that Amazon is burning and deforestation is, you know, the rates are so high, the media is reacting, but we need more than that. We need a coverage, you know, a permanent coverage on that. And as a Brazilian, I feel that I'm privileged, because I know a little bit of this country and the importance of the indigenous communities and forest people in this, in protecting our forests, in protecting our future, you know, our lives. And journalism, I think, plays an important role in that, on that. Yeah, this is a brief, was the idea I wanted to share. And yeah, feel free to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Yeah, I guess my question is, as you were saying, no, it's a dangerous field, like there are risks, and you're fighting against big companies, which even sometimes are getting indirect support from the government. So in that sense, you were saying it's important to still bring out these stories for science, for the international community. But yeah, I guess my question is, but you could kind of already answered, is what would, who would you really then want to be bringing these stories across to be able to make that change? Or what is the view of Indigenous people themselves? What do they tell you in this regard?
Well, I think it's important to bring these stories across. What I try to reach, the normal person, the consumer, not just governments, because consumer makes decisions, consumers puts pressure on companies, on governments. I try to communicate with, my mother, my father, my sister, who works in a bank, for example. I want these people to understand what is going on, but they feel, as here where I live now, where I am now, in the southeast part of Brazil, which is the richest part of Brazil, and the most important in terms of economics. So they feel so a part of this world, of the Amazon, of the forest, indigenous communities, and somehow I try to bridge, to work on this bridge. And if we are aware of what Brazil is and the importance of forests for our, survival, I think we can act as a normal person, as voters, you can elect people who defend these ideas, who people who know what the importance of, keeping forests and carbon on the ground. So this is what I'm not so ambitious. I just want to communicate with, with people.
No, absolutely. And I don't think there is one, of course, audience. I think the important thing, and actually this would link me already to Abdel, is that you are, you want to bring your message across to different stakeholders, because in the end, for change to be made, you will need these different sectors. And it's also one of the reasons why we're here today. And I think, Abdel, if you want to say anything on how People's Planet Project is trying to incorporate those different fields.
Yeah, first of all, I'm very happy to hear the different perspectives. And like Nadia was saying, it is very important to understand the local context, and we can do so through her experience. Brazil is probably one of the outliers in terms of how dangerous it is for indigenous communities to tell their own stories, and for journalists like Nadia and other storytellers to cover those stories. That's why we have been working with local ambassadors, and Nadia is actually one of them. It is to understand how storytelling could be beneficial in exposing the unsustainable practices while preserving indigenous wisdom and their territories. And from People's Planet Project, we are very happy to welcoming more indigenous filmmakers as our local ambassadors, while putting indigenous voices at the forefront. So People's Planet Project is a film initiative responding to the accelerating deforestation rates and indigenous livelihood destruction. It started with working on a variety of films regarding indigenous forest preservation, while actually realizing that little was being done to improve the self-determination of indigenous communities and their abilities to protect their forests. And this is when the idea started of forming a global movement of filmmakers and training indigenous communities to tell first-hand stories on the threats they face and cover the topics that are most urgent to them. And after close consultation with the indigenous leaders and community members on their needs in defending their forest territories, video and geospatial mapping were identified as major tools for the advancement of indigenous rights. And we have incorporated this into our approach, which is as follows. We bring indigenous rights to the attention of civil society and policymakers through documentaries. However, most stories about indigenous communities are still portrayed through the eyes of a filmmaker. And we are challenging the status quo of storytelling by providing young indigenous community members with the opportunity to tell their own stories and give them the power of expression and self-determination. We combine storytelling with geospatial data, so we train indigenous communities and build their capacity to map indigenous land, to secure tenure and monitor environmental change using spatial data. And our ultimate goal is to empower indigenous communities to protect forest territories and its biodiversity through powerful stories and geospatial data that could be used as proof of evidence in legal cases against deforestation. We therefore link indigenous communities with local environmental lawyers involved in groundbreaking environmental and human rights issues. And this approach of using storytelling, geospatial data, and indigenous rights advocacy will allow communities to secure ancestral land and take on legal battles to prevent commercial land grabbing and deforestation. We track our impact to determine how much of the video content and spatial maps is used as proof of evidence in court, and how many hectares of indigenous forest areas are reclaimed after our intervention. As a relatively new movement, we aim to scale up our workshops from 3 targeted communities in 2021 to 20 communities in 2024, while protecting at least 5 million hectares of indigenous forest lands from being deforested in the next 4 years. We have therefore developed a geostorytelling curriculum to transfer those skills to a younger generation of indigenous community members through a 12-day geostorytelling workshop, which is called Geostory Camps. And the Geostory Camps are designed to transfer the fundamentals of filmmaking and geospatial mapping to a younger generation among indigenous communities. And participants will learn the essentials of filmmaking to communicate context, action, and emotion, but more importantly, to acquire or to learn the major requirements in order for the content to be sufficient enough to be used as evidence in court. And participants will also learn how to use GPS devices and coordinates to localize their territory while using spatial data on deforestation and fire detection as additional layers to their base map, including alert systems on forest loss. And students will be equipped with video cameras and gear, including GPS devices, in order to create their own content while receiving long-term coaching from the People's Planet project team. And this is all embodied within our geostorytelling platform, which is called Tribal Stories. Tribal Stories is an initiative by People's Planet project in partnership with several indigenous alliances. And the platform is an urgent response to the alarming deforestation rate and serves as an evidence-based platform for indigenous communities to resist large-scale forest loss on a legal level using participatory films and geospatial data. And each trained community will have a dedicated page on this platform with films created by indigenous communities on the topics that are most urgent to them. So indigenous communities document ancestral knowledge and stories through films that will be or that will contribute to preserving indigenous wisdom and customs. But also films created by indigenous communities capturing evidence of environmental change and indigenous forest destruction. And this can be, for instance, drone images documented with the date and geolocation. And spatial data gathered by indigenous communities on deforestation and fire hotspots that are currently taking place in their territories. And all this content is accessible to the global audience, but more importantly, it can be used by the communities alongside their lawyers as proof of evidence that indigenous forest destruction is taking place, so appropriate measures may be taken to prevent it. Indigenous communities are facing a crucial window of opportunity to protect their existence. The forest territories they live on and the wisdom they hold to preserve those territories are all under threat. Indigenous communities or indigenous elders hold the knowledge necessary to survive, which has been traditionally preserved by oral dissemination. And the new generation has a realistic fear that if things continue as they are now, their elders will pass away and the wisdom they hold might disappear. This fear has become even more realistic due to the current pandemic, and it is therefore an urgent matter for the younger generation to acquire the skills to visually document ancestral knowledge and to be able to prove environmental destruction within their territories. And we believe that video technology and geospatial data could be used hand in hand as a tool for the advancement of indigenous rights and the preservation of nature.
Thank you so much, Abdel. My question to you is the one which I would like all speakers to answer and open the floor for a bit of a discussion, an interdisciplinary perspective to the panel, which is, what do you think the way forward is for storytelling and its role in aiding communities with conservation goals?
Yeah, indigenous communities are on the front line of deforestation and therefore well placed to document the unsustainable practices in real time. And I think the way forward would be to amplify their voices so they are able to cover the topics that are most urgent to them. And if done well, and this would be to give them the complete freedom of self-expression and the tools to express themselves, through new media, indigenous communities would be able to document the unsustainable practices, to expose deforestation that is happening in their territories, while at the same time safeguard hundreds of years of indigenous wisdom and history that would help the new generation of indigenous leaders and the rest of the world to preserve our forest and our planet that is very dear to us.
Yeah, I agree with Abdel. We have to empower them, not just going there and ask questions, but empower the local communities. Not to be colonialist, as someone, I think was Álvaro mentioned that we have this heritage. So although my great-grandmother was indigenous woman, which was captured in Bahia by a man, and so I have this on my blood as well. So we have to empower them with being humble when we go to them and listening, and because we have this culture here in Brazil that many journalists, they go there and they want the people to answer the question in a way, in a specific way. They don't have the patience to listen to the people, Yeah, I think empowering the local communities is a way.
Yeah, I very much agree with what you were saying, and what I was about to add is that I think that we are facing such huge and daunting social and environmental challenges that I think that all sources of evidence that we can gather and that we can bring into the table matter. I mean, be it geospatial data, as Abdel was mentioning, storytelling, bringing it to court. Like, we really cannot afford to lose the insights and the perspectives of all these different knowledge systems. I tend to see the problem as a big puzzle, and all the pieces are scattered around the world, and some of these pieces are in the hands of indigenous communities. I really think that what we are seeing in this social crisis is that the stories that we've been telling about the environmental crisis, about deforestation, the stories that we've been telling haven't been enough. we need to tell better stories. We need to really garner other ways of communicating about what's happening around the world. And I think that indigenous stories do have some moral guidance there and could hold some of the keys to address these challenges. I think that we can find huge inspiration there. And if I think of the role that research can play, that is that mobilizing all these different knowledge systems, mobilizing all these different stories requires the right processes. And I think that there's issues, ethical issues at play, there's issues of intellectual property rights, there's lots of different things, and neo-colonialism, as we were speaking about. And perhaps what researchers could help doing is crafting legitimate processes or helping to really craft those processes that might help to empower indigenous peoples while at the same time acknowledging their rights and their governance. I think that we tend to speak a lot about indigenous peoples as stakeholders, and I think that we should perhaps move the conversation towards them as being knowledge holders and rights holders. And that's something that we need different voices, and mobilizing those voices will require lots of conversations such as the ones that we are having right now, in terms of really bringing all the different evidence from different disciplines and trying to really weave all that together to make this world a better place for future generations.
And just to add to that, I couldn't agree more with what all the speakers are saying, Álvaro, Nadia, Adel, and everyone, all of you. I mean, in the sense of just bringing in different perspective and different areas of expertise and opening different avenues. This is about the stories, it's about gathering stories, it's about amplifying voices. But what we need to amplify are the voices of the community from the community perspective. And this doesn't only just bring the stories to those who are far away from the communities, but also creates a movement within indigenous communities from different parts of the world that can recognize common problems and common solutions as well. They're not isolated. They are really part of a global web. And what these stories, I mean, and social media plays a key role, and the knowledge of, especially the young community members, of accessing Instagram and social media platforms is creating movements. We saw them in New York last year during the Climate Week in the streets organized, and they organized all that via internet as well and social media platforms. So there is a lot that technology can bring to the table, but that cannot happen just as a movement that comes and goes. It needs the social structure to drive change, and that's where we see the importance of legislation, the importance of really integrating land rights approaches, the importance of looking at indigenous peoples not as stakeholders but as rights holders, and to put their voices at the same level as other voices in the negotiation of discussions and decision making.
Should I say as well that I want to bounce back on the word used by Adele, which is self-determination, which is a strange concept. It means a lot and not much, but I think in that context is very important because we need to decolonize what is storytelling. It's been very, I've used the word folklore before, but I think many communities, most of the world still see storytelling as something that is nice to put in a book, but not very important. I think what we're lacking in the world is the storytelling, and I was always struck by indigenous communities, wherever you go, in the Arctic, in the Amazon, in the plains of Africa, in the desert, what is storytelling is the different approach between humans and nature, which is something that's been erased from our global economy, and that's what we are sick of. So this is where storytelling is much more important than just something which is nice to listen to and folkloric and to be put in books. It's actually calling humanity to go back to we are part of the ecosystem. And I've always been struck by the way, for any communities that we talked about today, it's true. We have lost that, and a serious danger. So I would say this is why going back to storytelling, it's important. It's going back to this: what are we humans' relation with the rest of nature? Alvaro's first slide was about this. When you see a forest, you might just see a forest, but actually the community will see something very different. Every leaf has a story to tell, because they're considered as part of ourselves as humanity. And this is something that is not very much part of the debate. So, you know, there's a bit of a push to recognize right of nature, but again, indigenous peoples are not in the leading seats. And I think this is what we need to do, is to support these efforts. But again, being very humble, it's not for us to say, it's for us to be the vehicle to support. And I think this is really what is going to be difficult, because there's no outcome. As you said, I think, Nadia, there's no, often we ask questions that already have an answer, you know, the way we frame them. And I think it's a lot of the politics of listening, something that is not very valued in most societies. You know, we need to start to listen more. And I think storytelling is the entry point. If you can start to listen to storytelling, then you are really learning to decolonize the relation with nature.
Thank you so much for joining. And as Abdel was saying, we so want to mention how important it would be to have an Indigenous speaker, but the Indigenous speaker we had was not able to attend due to bad connection and difficult circumstances at the moment in regards to the pandemic as well. But of course, I think this is one of the very important things that we all agree on, that storytelling is crucial to safeguard Indigenous communities, but the way it's being done can be improved, leaving behind a colonial perspective, as Jeremy was saying, and focusing on the community's perspective. I think this really can be done by keeping this discourse going, like we're doing today, and work together in different cultures and different disciplines to really acknowledge their importance in conservation practice and global sustainability, which is absolutely crucial in the current context we are living in. I think we can all agree. So thank you so much for joining, Paula, Jeremy, Álvaro, Nadia, and Abdel, and for all the listeners as well. I think it would be amazing if we can keep this discourse going, either on the People's Planet Project's website, social media, etc., to know what other people think about this as well. So thank you very much.